and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Chinese President Xi Jinping made his first state visit to North Korea, demonstrating unity in their alliance. Today we discuss how this symbolic trip impacts the stalled denuclearization talks between the U.S. and North Korea. In the studio with me today, Mr. Richard Johnson, Senior Director for Fuel Cycle and Verification at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Mr. Johnson served as the Director for Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Richard, Chinese President Xi Jinping's trip to North Korea apparently was formed in a very quick manner. And what do you think of his timing?
Well, I think the timing is very interesting. Obviously, we have the G20 summit coming up in Japan very soon, where Xi Jinping will meet with President Trump and many other foreign leaders. I think that when you see Chinese presidents and North Korean leaders meet, it's often an opportunity to touch base and to sort of coordinate before next steps. Now, this could be a sign that there is going to be another push for some sort of diplomatic efforts, possibly the inter-Korean channel, possibly reinvigorating the U.S. DPRK channel. But I think at the bare minimum, Xi Jinping will want to know what's on the mind of Kim Jong-un, and he will want to convey to him some issues, including the idea of not getting into sort of provocative activities and trying to keep the environment peaceful while we're trying to figure out what comes next after the Hanoi summit.
Mm-hmm. So as for what's in the minds of Chairman Kim, what Chairman Kim said to President Xi is that North Korea has taken a lot of positive measures and that the relevant party did not respond actively and that North Korea is waiting for the relevant party to meet halfway. But this sounds like North Korea's positions ever since the Singapore summit, that North Korea is the one who took actions and the United States needs to reciprocate. So did you expect North Korea to come up with more positive comments this time?
Well, in a way, what's really interesting about that statement is that it could be a signal that Kim Jong-un is ready to come back to some kind of dialogue with the U.S. But I think that even more interestingly, it looked like Xi Jinping was offering his good offices, really inviting China into the process. And I think that Kim Jong-un put some distance between himself and the idea that Xi Jinping would necessarily have something to bring to President Trump at the G20.
Mm-hmm. Specifically, why did you think that?
Well, because Kim Jong-un indicated that he would remain patient in terms of waiting for the opportunity for dialogue, whereas Xi Jinping was talking about a more active role for China in supporting peace and denuclearization on the peninsula. So what Kim Jong-un wanted is for Xi Jinping to have his back, but not to get in the way of the process between the U.S. and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Some people view Chairman Kim's comments that he will stay patient as signaling that he will not return to provocations. So what is your take?
Well, I don't think it's in his interest to return to provocations right now. I think that he feels he's made some progress, particularly seeing the U.S. ROK joint military exercises still essentially being suspended. And I think he's seen a lot of progress in building diplomatic credibility around the world. He's now had his 5th meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This is the first visit of a Chinese president to Pyongyang in 14 years. That's a very big diplomatic win for Kim Jong-un. And he's also now met with Vladimir Putin, of course, the inter-Korean summits, and possibly there's even talk of a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Abe. Mm-hmm. So I think that right now, Kim Jong-un does hold all of the cards. He can sort of sit there and wait. And I think what we've seen since Hanoi is an internal debate and an internal review of what happened there. And they're trying to figure out what comes next. And this is frustrating for the U.S. side because they'd like to re-engage and start to talk about what denuclearization means. But right now, the North Koreans are not picking up the phone, and that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. And as Scott has mentioned, China, President Xi invited himself to the process. And do you expect China to take more center stage in the nuclear diplomacy from here on?
Well, traditionally, we've seen sort of a bifurcated approach from Beijing. When I worked on the six-party talks, it was always very interesting. They would come to us and say, this nuclear issue is really a U.S. DPRK issue. So go to Pyongyang, you go talk to the North Koreans, you figure out this nuclear issue, and then come back to us and we'll try to resolve it in the six-party framework. And then the U.S. would actually go and do that and talk to them in a bilateral way. And then we'd get these very harried phone calls from Beijing saying, what did you do? Please tell us. We're the chairman of the six-party talks. Mm-hmm. So they want to be involved, but they also don't want to necessarily take the role on of solving the nitty-gritty of the denuclearization process. So I think Scott is right, is that part of what this summit was about was reminding Kim Jong-un and reminding the international community that China has been a bit quiet in these matters recently, but they are a big player in determining the future of the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what Richard is saying indicates that Xi Jinping may have had a tactical reason and a strategic reason to try to go to Pyongyang right at this moment. The tactical reason is that compared to trade or Hong Kong or Taiwan, North Korea is an issue where the U.S. and China can actually agree on the importance of denuclearization. And so this gives him something to talk about at the G20 that is not inherently adversarial. But the strategic reason is that China insists on being included and in protecting its core interests in its periphery. And shoring up the relationship with North Korea is Xi Jinping's best option to pursue that strategic objective at this time.
And Scott, what do you think behind closed doors? What do you think Chairman Kim and President Xi put on the table regarding denuclearization?
Well, see, that's what's really hard to know. I mean, again, as has been the case in the past, what we saw is that in the North Korean media, including Xi Jinping's contribution to Norong Shinmun, no mention of denuclearization. But in the Global Times, a mention of China's commitment to continuation of that process. And so really the most important thing that Xi Jinping brought with him to Pyongyang was the message that China wanted to see a U.S.-North Korea dialogue go forward. And the thing that Kim Jong-un has benefited from the most is the perception that China has North Korea's back. And that gives North Korea a sense of strategic depth that Kim Jong-un needs in order to be able to effectively engage with the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And Richard, the relations soured since North Korea conducted 4 nuclear tests since President Xi took power. Mm-hmm. And that relationship actually improved a little bit last year with multiple visits by Chairman Kim to Beijing. Now with President Xi's visit to Pyongyang, do you think the relations has finally fully restored?
I think there's never going to be a full restoration of relations that was there prior to, say, the full development of the nuclear program. I don't think we're going to hear the phrase lips and teeth very much again, which was, of course, the historical reference to how close China and North Korea were after the Korean War. They're just different priorities from Beijing and Pyongyang. That having been said, I think that Xi Jinping likes the fact that North Korea has not been undertaking provocative activities. I think Xi Jinping likes the fact that without lifting a finger, he's been able to see a reduction in U.S. military activities on the Korean Peninsula because of this bilateral work and because, to a certain extent, because of the inter-Korean summits. So China, to a certain extent, is sitting pretty. They like where they are. They've seen some stability come over. But to Scott's point, I think that they are a little bit concerned that the stalemate since Hanoi could lead to a retrenchment in that area. And this is why it's another point where they can sort of raise the China card and say, we are here, we all want to make sure that there's going to be no provocative activities. And it makes sense that they would want to arrange a summit at this time for that reason.
Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, it is between the United States and North Korea. And so how much role can China play in this?
Well, and as Richard has said, there's an ambivalence, I think, on the part of the Chinese with regards to getting involved in this. They want the process to go forward. What we have not yet seen, I think, is a detailed and practical plan of action that the Chinese have been willing to put on the table beyond the idea that peace and denuclearization should go together in a process that gains momentum from U.S.-North Korea interaction. And so they have their own set of interests. A lot of them are related to maintaining influence, but they haven't yet demonstrated a capacity or, frankly, a willingness to come in and be the critical player in trying to solve this Korea problem.
I might just add to that the Chinese have a different historical timeline here of what they want to see happen. When we would work on six-party talks and even in later negotiations, the Chinese would always say, step by step, man-manda, we will get there eventually. But step by step for North Korea, for a Chinese, could be, a 50-year time period. For the United States, they'd like to see something done by the end of this presidential term. And so I think that the goals, the short-term goals for China and the United States potentially are different on North Korea denuclearization. The United States would like to see all the fissile material removed, no more nuclear weapons. For China, they might be comfortable with just a freeze and maybe some verification and just saying, we'll get there eventually down the road. So we have a little bit of a, if you will, culture clash on the time frames here, even though the overall goal is the same.
Right, so as you've just mentioned, the United States and China have different ideas about how denuclearization should go forward, and China would like to, be kept in this process. So, Richard, do you think eventually the regional stakeholders will need to get involved? And what lessons can we draw from the cooperative threat reduction on the former Soviet countries on North Korea?
Well, it's a great question. And we've just, in my organization, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, has just released a new report that argues that the so-called cooperative threat reduction or Nunn-Lugar approach, which was used in the former Soviet Union to help remove nuclear material, to help improve nuclear safety and dismantle nuclear missiles, could be applied to North Korea. And one of the big benefits of doing that is it could bring in additional partners. Right now, as you said, the current negotiations are U.S. and DPRK bilateral. I do think that that's an important component to getting the technical details right about denuclearization. But at the end of the day, I think North Korea will not feel comfortable in getting rid of nuclear weapons if the rest of the international community is not there to support them in a post-nuclear world. And that's where this so-called cooperative threat reduction approach, where countries like China, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and even others outside the region could come in and provide economic support, help to take the people who are working currently in the Yongbyon facility and move them to peaceful work so that they, A, have a job to do, and B, don't proliferate around the world. And also to encourage North Korea to use the technologies that they have now to engage with scientists around the world on non-nuclear activities and sort of interconnect North Korean scientists and engineers with the rest of the world. It's a small step, but it is actually part of the step towards normalization.
And Scott, traditionally, Chinese presidents' visits to North Korea were always with presents to North Korea, things like fertilizers and food and heavy oil. But under the current circumstances of sanctions regime, what kind of present do you expect?
Well, the most important present was Xi Jinping's presence in Pyongyang, because that really elevated Kim Jong-un, and it had helped him to achieve the objective of having a strategic weight between Washington and Beijing. But beyond that, as you mentioned, usually there is some kind of economic transfer from Beijing to Pyongyang, and it's probably going to be in the form of food aid, rice. It could also be in the form of a tacit easing of enforcement of sanctions on the border between China and North Korea.
And any sort of economic support could erode the effectiveness of sanctions.
Well, from a U.S. perspective, we're wanting to see maximum pressure, and that means application of the letter of the law, not just the spirit of the law, or making sure that the spirit of the law is actually being honored. And so, a lot of this in terms of really resource transfers to North Korea is not what the U.S. Wants to see at this time. I think the Chinese are aware of that, but of course they're modulating the rheostat based on their own interests, and those interests don't always coincide with those of the U.S.
I might just add on sanctions relief that I do think that the Chinese are trying to enforce sanctions, and at a higher level than they ever have before. When I worked on this in the government, we always had challenges encouraging China to take more active steps towards sanctions enforcement. The problem is the Chinese economy is a little bit like the Wild West. There's lots of small entities and individuals, and frankly, China doesn't put the resources into export control enforcement that other countries like the United States do. So I think when you see these reports about China skirting sanctions, in some cases, maybe the Chinese government is aware, but in many cases, I think the Chinese government is not encouraging this. And if they could do something about it, they might. But right now, they're not putting the money where their mouth is in terms of sanctions enforcement to go after companies before they undertake these activities. They might punish them afterwards and we might never hear about it. But right now, all we're hearing about are the leaks and the loopholes.
We'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
I spoke with President Xi this morning of China. We'll be meeting at the G20. China very much wants to discuss the future, and so do we.
President Xi's trip to North Korea is followed by the Group of 20 summit in Osaka, Japan. President Xi will get a chance to brief President Trump and other regional leaders about his meeting with Chairman Kim. Now, Scott, we just went over the outcomes of President Xi's trip to North Korea. Is this good news? Is he bringing good news to President Trump?
I think he will have some positive news to report, but really the more significant issues in the meeting between Xi and Trump are going to be related to trade, Taiwan, Hong Kong, these other hard issues. So I think what they have is a cover story that can make for saying that they have a successful meeting. But the really good news from Xi would be progress, especially in terms of completing an understanding on trade.
Now, Richard, there are views that President Xi's trip to North Korea gives him leverage that bolsters his bargaining position against President Trump. Do you agree?
I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think sometimes people in the media like to connect lots of different things and try to string a story together. The reality is the North Korea issue is stalled, and the timing of the calendar is there's a G20 summit. So I'm not sure that there's a huge connectivity here, but I think in the case of North Korea versus trade, while the US president may be trying to make some linkages and has very explicitly, including in his tweets, I think the Chinese see these as fairly separate buckets. There will be, of course, discussion on both.
And Scott, do you expect Chairman Kim wants to deliver any message to President Trump through President Xi?
I'm wondering whether the message hasn't already been delivered in Kim Jong-un's statement that he is patiently waiting for a resumption of dialogue. And also there's a double edge, I think, to the idea of passing a message through Xi Jinping to Trump. Really, Kim doesn't want to rely too much on Xi Jinping. And so I think that it's more likely that the North Koreans are going to let us know directly if they're ready to re-engage.
Now, Richard, this G20 summit, we have regional leaders, stakeholders, 5 countries all gathering in the same venue. The sheer fact that all the leaders are coming here, how important is this G20 summit to revive the stalled denuclearization talks?
Well, I think it's important, but again, at this point, I think most of the effort has to be done between the US and North Korea, and to a lesser extent by South Korea and China. I think for now, the G20 will be a venue to exchange views, have a little bit of back and forth, essentially a little bit of a gossip session. But at the end of the day, as Scott said, what's holding us up now on these talks is that the US is saying no sanctions relief before complete denuclearization. The North Korean side is saying that we need to see some sort of corresponding measure if we're going to do anything on this. And until there's sort of a movement to find a compromise, of which maybe CTR is one, we're going to be stuck.
Right. Adding to that, Special Representative Steve Biegun recently in a speech said that both Pyongyang and Washington see the need to be more flexible. So how specifically can we be flexible, the two sides?
Well, one way would be to come to dialogue at the working level in order to try to understand more of the details on each side. And that would be, I think, a significant step forward. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize post-Hanoi, more than ever, we see the limits in terms of the overlap between the U.S. and North Korea. And so I think this is just to say that even though Representative Biegun wants to get back to talks, the magnitude of the task before him, I would argue, has never seemed greater than it looks post-Hanoi.
One of the interesting tidbits from Hanoi was that the United States sent 16 subject matter experts to Hanoi, including nuclear experts, lawyers, sanctions experts, and the North Koreans sent nobody of that type. And in fact, the North Koreans said the only person who can speak on the nuclear issues is the chairman. That's not going to be a way to get a deal. If we can encourage the North Korean side to send some of their nuclear experts, or even if the U.S. can send some experts to North Korea to meet with them, maybe even at Yongbyon, that could start to break down this impasse.
So, Scott, if we don't see any significant progress during the G20 and the subsequent bilaterals, do you see any new opportunities coming up to revive these stalled talks?
Well, the opportunity to revive the talks really lies in the hands of Pyongyang. I think that Biegun has indicated that we're ready to go. The North Koreans may be looking for some kind of additional signal from the U.S. side that we're easing our position. But quite frankly, I think that what Representative Biegun had to say with regards to going back to first principles in terms of a simultaneous and parallel approach to implementing the Singapore Declaration is probably about the best that they're going to get. And so now is the time to go ahead and try to build on that and see, frankly, we're a year late, but now is the time to try to build on that and see if we can move forward.
Richard, is this the golden opportunity, the series of summitry that we need to seize?
Well, I think summits are only one way of doing these things. I actually think it was right for President Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un because of the way the North Korean system works. It is a top-down approach. But as I just said, I don't think we should be thinking about these as summits. We should be thinking about these as the diplomatic process. If you look at the Iran deal, which is very much in the news now, the only way that was achieved was with many, many, many hours of working level discussions. My colleagues and I who worked on that Iran deal spent weeks and weeks and weeks in Vienna. And at the end, it actually involved many senior officials spending, almost 2 weeks devoted to just one very specific issue. So again, the only way this is going to happen is if both sides are prepared to really write down what they want on a piece of paper and start passing that piece of paper back and forth. Even if they have to cross everything out and start over again, at least we start to work down where the differences are. Right now, we're just talking about principles, and that's not going to be a way to get a deal.
And it sounds like the working level talks really need to get going from here on. Now, let's move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have photo sheets of North Korean refugees held by a South Korean NGO, the North Korea Refugees Human Rights Association of Korea. The State Department, in its 2019 Trafficking in Persons report, put North Korea in the lowest tier, pointing out the North Korean government subjects its citizens to forced labor, both at home and abroad, and then uses proceeds to fund nefarious activities. Now, Scott, what's your reaction?
Well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We've known that trafficking has been going on of North Korean women for over 2 decades now. But I think that this picture gives a little bit of reality to the tragedy of that flow of North Korean citizens out into China and their exploitation.
For sure.
I think this is a reminder about what we're not talking about in these North Korea-U.S. talks, and that's the horrible human rights situation within North Korea and associated with North Korea. These women have apparently maybe been able to escape the country, but not to escape the ravages of the North Korean regime. And so this is a very difficult challenge for any president. It has been for over 2 decades. But I think that we have to find some way to raise the issue of North Korean human rights abuses. One way to do that might be to actually appoint a successor to Ambassador Bob King, the former special ambassador for North Korean human rights. Right now, that seat is sitting empty at the State Department, and it would be a good way to remind the community that while we're focused on denuclearization and peace, human rights cannot be ignored at the same time.
That's a great point, 100%.
Right. And that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.